Today at the National Press Club, Greens leader Adam Bandt. The Greens stocks have swollen in the 47th Parliament, and with 12 senators and 4 lower house MPs, Mr Bandt is hoping his party's influence on the new government will also grow. Adam Bandt with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club today and for today's Westpac address. I'm David Crowe, the Chief Political Correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and a Director here at the club. Our guest today is Adam Bandt, Leader of the Australian Greens. His address today is entitled The Greens and the 47th Parliament, because of course it is a new era in this new Parliament. Now we all know Adam Bandt as the Leader of the Greens, and this is his first speech to us here at the National Press Club since he led the party to a significant series of victories at the recent election. The Greens now have 4 seats in the lower house and 12 in the Senate, making them essential to the passage of every law. And Adam, of course, started that trend in the lower house by winning the seat of Melbourne in 2007, after working as a lawyer in Melbourne for many years. But his background is about more than that. I find it very interesting that he's about one of a dozen members of Parliament with a PhD, even though he doesn't call himself Dr. Bandt. Let us know if you want us to change that. He's clearly a student of history, in fact Russian history and law, and his PhD was on legal theory. That is very good preparation for this Parliament, with every complication on every vote. And of course the immediate questions today are about the approach he and the Greens will take to the government bill on climate change, the issue of the week, which will be put to a vote, we expect, in the lower house sometime this week. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag is NPC. So there's plenty for us to hear about from Dr. Bandt today and plenty to ask about. So please welcome him to our podium.
Thanks very much, David. There's no medical doctors in Parliament House after hours, and there's an unwritten rule amongst parliamentarians that if someone gets into strife, then one of the medical doctors will cross party lines and go and help them. And I live in fear that if I call myself a doctor, I'm going to get that call one evening when someone's in dire need, and I'll be able to advise them about political and legal theory, but not much else. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri. And I would like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty over this land was never ceded. I also want to acknowledge the importance of the discussion we're having as a nation now on how we can progress all parts of the Uluru Statement from the heart, including progress on truth and treaty in a way that preserves the sovereignty of First Nations peoples, as well as voice. And I want to make a special shout out to the First Nations communities on the front line of the climate crisis, like the Wujibul Wayabul community in Lismore, many of whom I met, fighting to rebuild their homes after the floods, or the traditional owners leading the fight against the climate bomb across the Beetaloo Basin and the Scarborough gas projects. We stand with you in the fight to protect country. I would also like to welcome the new Greens party room. What a joy to return to Canberra with 60% more Greens in the party room. There's an energy, an enthusiasm and an enormous appetite for what we can achieve together in this Parliament. And in the lower house, we have 3 new members: Max Chandler-Mather, Elizabeth Watson-Brown and Stephen Ryan. And now we hold the balance of power in the Senate. We've increased our numbers by 3, taking us to 12. And we welcome new Senators Penny Allman-Payne, Barbara Pocock and David Shoebridge. And they will join Senators Dorinda Cox and Jordan Steele-Johns, Sarah Hanson-Young, Lydia Thorpe, Janet Rice, Nick McKim, Peter Wish-Wilson, Maureen Faruqi and Larissa Waters to create the biggest Greens team in our nation's history. And thanks to these expanded numbers, in many instances, if the government wants to pass laws, they're going to need to work with us. And if we do, we believe in this parliament that we can truly reach for the stars. Tackling the challenges that we face, we can keep the Liberals out for a very long time and create a better life for all of us. Before the election, we said that we were aiming to grow our presence in both the House and the Senate and to hold the balance of power. Many ignored us, others scoffed, some used it as a scare campaign, but the community heard us loud and clear. And now, here we are, in balance of power in the Senate and part of the biggest crossbench this country has ever seen. And we're in this position because we ran a strong people-powered campaign based on two central policy planks. The first was no new coal and gas. The second was that big corporations and billionaires need to pay their fair share of tax so that we can tackle the cost of living and all have a better life. We had a climate alternative and an economic alternative to both of the establishment parties. Labor's vote went backwards, Liberals' vote went backwards, and the Greens' vote went up. This record Greens vote is a floor, not a ceiling. People voted for the Greens in record numbers to help shape this country's future. They voted for us to fight. They voted for us to work with others, and they voted for us to get things done. And we will. We will fight for our clear, popular demands, and we offer a realistic pathway to achieving them. The Greens are now in a powerful position. The Liberals are irrelevant. With Peter Dutton as their leader, we expect they will go backwards. If they continue their denial, their defence of economic inequality, and a profound lack of integrity, they deserve to be irrelevant. In the first week of Parliament, for example, the only people to ask questions about the burden of inflation on everyday Australians was Andrew Wilkie and myself in the House of Representatives and our colleagues in the Senate. The Liberals could lose even more seats in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane at the next election. Labor is now the party of the centre-right. You don't need Vote Compass to tell you that, although it was good to have that confirmed. Since Keating and Hawke, Labor has adopted neoliberalism, which has privatised public services, cut taxes for the wealthy and adopted more and more austerity. The Greens are now the only social democratic party in Australia. We see it as our job to get the country back to a fairer place so that everyone can have an affordable home, a free education, healthcare that includes our teeth and our mental health. We want to put an end to the outrageous stage 3 tax cuts and end the billions of dollars of public money going straight into the hands of big corporations and invest instead in people so that everyone can have a better life. Our working presumption is that Australia will end this term of Parliament with Labor the country's centre-right party, the Liberals a far-right irrelevance, and the Greens the dominant social democratic party in a country that still has a big, beating, progressive heart. So today, I'll outline how we will push the government to tackle the cost of living crisis and the inequality crisis. And after that, I'd like to make a few remarks about the other crisis we face, the climate crisis, and the climate change bill currently before Parliament. Labor spent the last 3 decades and then the last 3 years adopting the same economic policies as the coalition, going out of their way to reassure people during the election campaign that they were a small target and that there would be no real difference if the government changed. Well, people heard that message and Labor's vote went backwards. The Greens offered a straightforward proposition. Make the big corporations and billionaires pay their fair share of tax so that we can make life better for everyday people by getting dental into Medicare, making childcare free, wiping student debt and building affordable housing. This economic alternative is simple, achievable and relevant to people's everyday lives. And people responded. Because wealth inequality in Australia is the worst it has ever been. The profits share of the economy is higher than ever before, while the share going to wages is the lowest in history. There are over 3 million Australians living in poverty. Nearly 500,000 women over the age of 45 are at risk of becoming homeless. Too many young people cannot leave home because it's too tough to find an affordable place to live. Government income support forces people to live below the poverty line. Wages have flatlined before the pandemic, and now working people are going backwards. Unemployment is at record lows, but that hasn't flowed into a better life for working people. Working people have more insecure work, fewer rights, and wage theft is endemic across numerous industries. The Greens would tackle the cost of living crisis by making the billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share of tax to fund better services. Because if we don't, the corporations and the billionaires are going to keep price gouging and profiteering, while the rest of us struggle to access basic services like health, housing and education. The Greens are now the only party offering a social democratic alternative, and with inflation biting hard and cost of living pressures set to get worse, our plan is needed now more than ever. And it's where the Labor government's plan to dismantle our progressive tax system and adopt economic austerity policies will hurt everyday Australians unless they change tack and work with the Greens. The government needs to rethink its first budget, and we will push them to make what would be undoubtedly popular choices. Labor is proposing to make inequality worse by giving tax cuts to billionaires in its first budget. Labor's stage 3 tax cuts, which destroy our progressive taxation system, will make inequality in this country worse and turbocharge inflation. It will mean that working people in low-paid jobs are still under pressure, while billionaires like Clive Palmer will get a $9,000 a year tax cut every year. Right. The Greens want Clive Palmer to pay more tax, but Labor wants to give him a tax cut. 2/3 of these tax cuts will go to men, just 1/3 to women. In its first year, the wealthiest 1% will pocket as much from these tax cuts as the poorest 65% of the population combined. In balance of power in the Senate, we will push Labor to ditch these unfair tax cuts that will rip $244 billion out of the public purse. If these tax cuts for the very wealthy proceed, we will move a big step closer to US-style inequality. Reversing these massively unfair stage 3 tax cuts and putting the money into social services would be incredibly popular. But if the government doesn't yet have the courage to defend social democracy, here's another proposal that wouldn't breach any of Labor's Liberal light election promises to everyday people, but would make a real difference to people's lives right now. There are 2 things this government could do in the October budget to address the wage and cost of living crisis. First, the government should bring forward changes to childcare. Make childcare free and support the workforce. We don't need to wait for another review to tell us that childcare is in crisis. Secondly, the government should also put dental into Medicare, delivering real cost of living relief to everyone in this country. And this could be funded by a tax on billionaires and by making tax-dodging gas corporations start to pay tax. Each household spends on average $960 a year on dental care, and the average out-of-pocket costs of childcare are $2,997 per child. Getting dental into Medicare and making childcare free could save a family of 4 up to nearly $7,000 a year. This would deliver real, immediate and lasting cost of living relief. We had free childcare during the pandemic, so we know it can be implemented quickly. And we have a Medicare system that everyone understands, so we know we can add dental line items to it. These would be long-lasting changes that would deliver real relief to everyday people battling with high inflation and low wages and incomes. Better than a short-lived cut to fuel excise that can be wiped out by a profiteering petrol corporation, these measures would mean people are better off not just right now, but next month and next year, year after year. And we can pay for this by making the billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share of tax. As the country was suffering through lockdowns, Australia's billionaires made out like bandits, growing their wealth faster than billionaires in any other country in the world. Regular people are struggling with years of no wage increases, but the obscene wealth of Australia's 50 richest billionaires has increased by 86% since the pandemic. A small annual tax on the wealth of billionaires is a reasonable response to widening economic inequality right now. Where, right now, Gina Rinehart owns 1.2% of the entire Australian landmass, yet the average time to see a dentist on the public waiting list in Queensland is 663 days. In a country where 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax, the gas industry are poster-child tax avoiders. They're not just profiteering off a Russian dictator's invasion of Ukraine. They're driving up energy costs in Australia as well, all while giving next to nothing to the public purse. The ATO has called the gas industry, and I quote, systemic non-payers of tax. In 1 year, 27 big gas corporations brought in $77 billion of revenue but paid no tax. 96% of the gas industry is overseas owned, so billions in profits are going offshore effectively tax-free. Our gas tax laws are broken. When a nurse pays more tax than a billionaire corporation, something is seriously wrong. And even worse, in many instances, these big corporations don't even pay royalties for the gas. They get the gas for free. The gas tax laws in this country are broken, and our country is being taken for a ride. The combined cost of free childcare now and dental in Medicare would be $18.2 billion a year averaged over a decade, fully offset by the $18.3 billion revenue raised from a billionaire's tax and fixing our gas tax laws. People need help with cost of living urgently. We don't need to wait for another Productivity Commission inquiry or another election. The government could put in place free childcare now. They could bring dental into Medicare now if they have the courage to act. The Greens are offering to deal with the pressing inflation and wage crisis by passing fully funded free childcare and dental into Medicare through the Senate, paid for with a tax on billionaires and big gas corporations making super profits. The numbers are there in the Parliament. The only thing standing in the way is Labor's willingness to act. We'll continue to make practical suggestions around where we could make big savings this year. We've had a range of other options costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office that show there's billions of dollars of handouts to the big coal and gas corporations, which could be scrapped to fund essential services and reduce the cost of living. And we'll have more to say about this before the budget. Budget legislation doesn't often get amended, but we reserve the right to amend Labor's first budget if Labor proceeds with tax cuts for billionaires and handouts to coal and gas corporations while leaving everyday people behind. Neoliberalism, privatisation and corporate greed has gone way too far. Governments are handing future generations huge debts, economic, social and environmental debts, while big corporations are making record profits. We believe that Labor has made too many sacrifices to appease the right and get into power, and that might send the country broke. We appreciate that the coalition has left a real mess. We understand there's a lot to do. But in this term of Parliament, the only thing holding back serious environmental and social democratic change is the level of Labor's ambition. Which brings me to climate. The climate crisis is caused by the mining and burning of coal, oil and gas. You do not end the climate wars by opening more coal and gas mines. At some point in our history, we have to say it is time for no more coal and gas projects. The United Nations believes it's time now. The International Energy Agency believes it's time. The Pacific Island leaders believe it's time. Thousands of young climate strikers believe it's time. Even the Pope believes it's time. Labor seems to believe something different. Labor seems to believe that they can keep approving more coal and gas and that the market will make the call when it's time to stop. Labor wouldn't leave the minimum wage or aged care nurse ratios to the market to decide, so they shouldn't do it with the future of humanity either. It's government's job to keep people safe, not to defend the profits of Santos and Woodside. Worse, channeling Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister says that somehow our coal is better for the climate. It's not. The Environment Minister thinks that coal burnt elsewhere doesn't count. It does. You can't put the fire out while pouring more petrol on it. You can only end the climate wars by keeping coal and gas in the ground. Right now, there are 114 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline. If they go ahead, more homes and businesses will become uninsurable. If we hit 2 degrees of warming or more and fail to meet the Paris Agreement goals, which is where Labor's weak targets take us, the Great Barrier Reef will die, as will the 60,000 jobs that depend on it. More coal and gas mines will cause more floods, fires and droughts. They will increase the cost of living, destroy infrastructure, ecosystems will collapse, and more species will become extinct. And more of us will die. And that's why, as we've been discussing and then negotiating the government's climate change bill, we've put such emphasis not just on the government's weak target, but on the need for a moratorium on new coal and gas. We also said there needed to be compromise, but also real action, and that our preference was to improve and pass the bill. In this parliament, where less than a third of the country voted Labor, yes, Labor has some mandate and the Greens have some mandate. But more important is our mandate from the planet and the laws of physics. If Labor continues to open up new coal and gas, the planet will burn. And that is the mandate that we all need to listen to. That is why we are bitterly disappointed that Labor has made it so clear over the last few weeks that they want to continue to open new coal and gas projects. While the government has been unwilling to adopt science-based targets and place a moratorium on new coal and gas, we have been able to secure improvements to the bill, ensuring that the target can be ratcheted up over time and that it's now Dutton-proofed with a genuine floor, which means the target cannot go backwards. Changes have also been made to put in place greater transparency, accountability and strengthened requirements on the Climate Change Authority. And government agencies such as Export Finance Australia, that in the past have funded coal and gas projects, will for the first time be forced to take climate targets into account, which should see them curbed from supporting fossil fuels. They join a range of other agencies with new limits, including Infrastructure Australia and the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, and more, which I'll come to in a moment. And that's why I can tell you today that tomorrow I will be joined by our Greens MPs in the House of Representatives in voting for the climate change bill. And when the bill comes before the Senate, we will vote for it there as well. So to be crystal clear, the Greens have improved a weak climate bill, but the fight to stop Labor opening new coal and gas mines continues. And in this parliament, the only obstacle to greater climate ambition is Labor. People need to be clear-eyed about the importance of this bill and that this government is bringing a bucket of water to a house fire. Worse, even this smallest of steps on the road to tackling the climate emergency could be wiped out by just one of the 114 new coal and gas projects in the government's investment pipeline. The fight begins now to to get Labor to stop opening coal and gas mines. The Senate inquiry here will be critical, as we expect that the Senate inquiry will show that the government cannot meet even the weak targets in this legislation if it opens new coal and gas projects, and that the government will need to rethink its approach. The Beetaloo gas project alone could lift Australia's pollution by up to 13%. And if all the coal, oil and gas projects on the books go ahead, Australia's pollution could rise by as much as a third from where it is now. None of this is included in Labor's modelling on its target. Here we have the science, the public and the international community on our side. Labor might be holding out now, but their position is ultimately untenable. And they can't go to upcoming climate summits vowing to open new coal and gas projects and expect to be taken seriously. Soon, the government will start to say how it will cut pollution, putting some meat on the bones of its centrepiece safeguard mechanism, which may reduce pollution by as little as 1% a year and ignite new climate wars if it allows new coal and gas projects to proceed. The Greens' imbalance of power here in the Senate will be crucial as the safeguard mechanism can be disallowed. Coming out of the negotiations, I can also announce that because the safeguard mechanism will deal with this question of new coal and gas projects, the government will have further discussions with the Greens as it designs this mechanism. Further, the government will also consider Greens' proposals to support coal and gas workers and communities, including the establishment of a transition authority. This was a crucial part of our election campaign, and this has to be the parliament that provides job and wage security to coal and gas workers as we do our part to tackle the climate challenge. So over the next 6 to 12 months, the battle will be fought on a number of fronts. We will comb the entire budget for any public money, any subsidies, handouts or concessions going to coal and gas corporations and amend the budget to remove them. We will push to ensure the safeguard mechanism safeguards our future by stopping new coal and gas projects. We will push for a climate trigger in our environment laws. And we will continue to fight individual projects around the country, like Beetaloo, Scarborough and Barossa. And I call on all Australians to join this battle to save our country, our communities, and indeed our whole civilisation from the climate and environment crisis. The climate crisis is not a future threat anymore. It's here. It's right in front of us and it's frightening. England, 40 degrees. Thousands of people dying in Europe last month from heat waves. Parts of New South Wales flooded 3 times this year. Thousands of people are living in makeshift accommodation from the floods and fires in the Morrison era. Our house is on fire and it's time we acted like it. The only way to keep people safe, manage the economy and reduce the cost of living is to take action on the climate crisis. We cannot afford to keep approving coal and gas. It is not only a more expensive form of power, it is deadly. It's blowing the budget and it's costing the earth. Labor said passing this bill will end the climate wars. Well, the Greens will do our bit, but Labor is set to undo Parliament's work by opening new coal and gas projects, unless we stop them. This term of Parliament has incredible potential. We're excited because nearly 2 million people voted Greens and we're not done yet. We're in a critical decade. It's a fork in the road. One path requires us to take a bold leap into a path less travelled, one which makes peace with our past and takes control of our future. The other path, the path well trodden in recent years, will see us continue to ignore our past, sell out our future and slide into inequality and climate-fuelled disasters. With their talk of clean coal and budget cuts, The new government is already sounding far too much like the old government for our liking. But the Greens want us to become a more equal country with a safer climate. We are not a rubber stamp. We will not be taken for granted. This is the critical decade for climate action, to tackle inequality and the cost of living crisis. The Greens will fight for a future for all of us.
Well, thank you very much for that address. There's plenty of news there and also plenty of things to ask about, and we've got many journalists ready to go. I'll kick things off with the first question, but I'll start with a fact check because I'm going to fact check myself. I said at the beginning that you were elected in 2007. It was 2010, of course. I'm sorry for that. I apologise if the past sometimes seems a bit of a blur, but it does lead me to think about that era when you first came in. And I wanted to ask you about how difficult it was for the Greens party room to make this decision on the climate bill because of course, the history is that in 2009 you voted against Labor on a major climate change issue, the CPRS, the emissions trading scheme, and in 2010 you worked with Labor. Did that history help to shape the decision that you made last night, and how difficult was that decision?
We've got such an amazing group of people, and now, excitedly, a bigger group of people. And we in the Greens, in our party room and across our party, have a principle of acting on consensus. And part of that is taking the time to talk through difficult issues. And one of the things that I really love about our party room is that everyone can put their position on the table and put different positions on the table and have them discussed in good faith, knowing that people will judge the argument on its merits. Right? We don't come into our meetings with predetermined positions organised by the factions or someone from the top saying this is how it's going to be. Anyone who's been involved in our amazing Greens movement over the years will know that that is something we take seriously, from our branch levels right up to the party room. And we made sure that we had enough time to work through this and have a number of meetings over a number of weeks, and then again over the last couple of days, so that we could reach a consensus position, and that's what this position is. Now, of course, during that there are different positions put forward. I would be disappointed if that wasn't the case. And the way that you get good outcomes is by having different positions put there, proposed, tested and refined. And we went through that process, but our commitment to ensuring we give ourselves the time to make this decision, to take into account everything, including knowing that we've just had a record Greens vote and that people want to see action, but as the votes show, they want more than what the Labor government is offering, was obviously something that influenced us. But it's by giving ourselves that time and that ability to talk it through, we've come to a position where every single one of us is going to line up behind it.
Our next question is from Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Bandt. You've said you'll support Labor's climate bill. However, you're clearly still sticking very closely to your policy of no new coal or gas mines. But given you're supporting this policy, how do you plan to push through that agenda with the Labor government, who have stated very, very clearly that they're not going to basically do that? I mean, has your best chance to push them on that now passed?
This is round one. There is 3 years of this parliament, and there are a number of points coming up where we will push to stop opening coal and gas. We're going to have to review this country's environment laws, and we want a climate trigger in those laws. The safeguard mechanism is going to have to be designed. And also, as I said during the speech, Labor's position is ultimately untenable. Like, the plea from the Pacific Islands recently was that if there's one thing we can do, it's stop opening new projects. We now have a situation where you have the Greens, US President Joe Biden, the Pacific Islanders, the UN, International Energy Agency on one side, and Labor and Liberal on the other. If Labor wants to host a climate summit here, which we support, but still open up new coal and gas mines, they may well not get it. Like, it may not happen here. This is increasingly becoming a deal breaker around the world, including with our closest security allies. Right? They want the government to act. So I understand that 2 weeks into the first parliament, Labor thinks it can maintain its position, but ultimately it can't. It is not a tenable position. And everyone knows it. Everyone knows it. Like, we can have a debate about what targets should be and how quickly to get out of existing coal and gas. But I think if you asked the everyday Australian, should we stop opening up new projects at a time that we're trying to cut them, most people would say yes. Most people would say yes. And I think the penny hasn't really dropped with the government yet, just how much the rest of the world and the Australian public wants climate action and wants them to stop opening projects. And we will use and pull every lever at our disposal in this parliament and on the streets with the movement to make that happen.
Thank you very much.
Our next question is from Rosie Lewis from The Australian.
Thanks for your speech, Mr. Bandt. Nancy Pelosi has made quite a historic trip in recent hours. I haven't heard your thoughts on China for some time. I wanted to know whether you think China poses a military threat to Australia. And what's your view of its growing presence in our region, in the Pacific?
Look, the Greens are concerned about rising tensions between US and China and what it means for our region. We're concerned about increasing instability. The whole world, but especially Australia, has a lot to lose if there is armed conflict between two nuclear-armed superpowers. We are in a position in Australia where we've got relationships with both to be taking steps to de-escalate. Right? What concerns us is that we don't see a plan on the table for de-escalation of tension. We only see a plan on the table for escalation of tensions. And what we will do is push for a de-escalation, knowing how much Australia has got to lose. That has to be the priority. And so as the new government considers its foreign policy, considers its defence policy, we will be saying we need a policy that puts Australia's interests and Australia's defence first, and that the best way to keep people safe in our region is to prioritise de-escalation, and we want to see the plan for that. Thanks very much.
Our next question is from Catherine Murphy from The Guardian.
Hello, Adam. Can I just clarify in respect of the climate trigger? Did you raise that specifically in these negotiations, and did you extract any undertakings to either have a process or, I mean, obviously there's an EPBC Act review, but I just want to be clearer in my mind than I am now about whether or not you put this specifically and whether any undertakings were given on that score. And also, is there a universe where, given Graham Samuel recommended something else, does it have to be a climate trigger specifically, or would comparable policy achieving the same or a similar result be acceptable? And if I can, just quick indulgence, David, forgive me. No, I'm just interested if you would, because obviously this is a really important decision that you've made, if you would be kind enough to reflect really on what the last 10 years have taught you about how you achieve climate action.
Maybe I'll take the second one first, and then remind me of the other ones if I don't get to it. What's become clear to me over the last 10 years and over the last 2 months as well is that we are up against some very powerful invested interests in this place. We're not just taking on different political parties, we're taking on the coal and gas corporations that are some of the biggest corporations in the world. And they have had politicians in their pockets for a very long time. So much so that they can make billions of dollars of profit, not even pay a cent of tax, and get the gas for free. They get to wreck our climate, and we then subsidise them and pay for the privilege of it. It is crystal clear that we're not just talking with and negotiating with a government, we're negotiating with the big coal and gas corporations that sit behind them and potentially have donated to their campaigns. We are very clear-eyed about the scale of getting climate action in Australia. And as the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuel pollution, one of the best gifts that we could give to the rest of the world to tackle the climate crisis is to stop opening new coal and gas. And in doing that, we are pushing against some very, very powerful interests. But we don't take donations from those big coal and gas corporations. And so we are in here fighting. Is that fight easy? No, it's not always easy, because you have to negotiate and push not just across the political spectrum, but also with these big corporations lurking in the background as well. But the other thing that I've learned, especially after this election, is that people are thoroughly sick of it, and people can see that the big driver behind the cost of living crisis is also the same as behind the climate crisis, which is that these big corporations are taking this country for a ride and everyone else is paying for it through more fires and floods, paying for it through higher cost of living. So every day it becomes clearer the scale of the challenge and the range of interests that are there against us as we try to take real climate action. But like every day, the fire in me to take that fight on gets renewed. It's a renewable energy source. And I hope that this Parliament, with more third voices in it than ever before, provides the circuit breaker. Like, I really do. And maybe we can even talk about campaign financing reform during the course of this Parliament as well, so that we're not in this position where we wonder whether we're negotiating with people whose party has just taken donations from the coal and gas corporations, but where decisions could get made in the public interest rather than for vested interests. And I think if we can get some of those changes during the course of this Parliament, we might start seeing decisions that are made that reflect the will of people. I guess the second thing that I've learned is that everyone has to give a bit, right? Everyone has to give a bit. And this is where I say the government's position is ultimately untenable, to stick with a low target and opening new coal and gas projects. I suspect they think at the moment that it's an electoral advantage to be saying we've got a weak climate target, but it's not. It's not. Like, the Australian people would reward them if they were more ambitious, and that's a realisation I think that the government is yet to come to. On the EPBC, it's woeful that under this country's environment laws you can approve projects even if they make climate change worse and destroy the environment. You don't even have to take it into account if you're a minister. You can just sign off on that. That has to change. Like, that has to change. But as I said during the speech, there are a number of other ways as well that we can tackle this question of stopping the opening of new coal and gas projects. And we've been very clear all along that we are open-minded about how that happens. But there needs to be a climate trigger in our environment laws, and that's why Sarah Hanson-Young introduced a bill to that effect into the Senate, and why we're going to be doing the same in the House. We need this to be a change that happens. I don't want to go into what happened during private discussions. The private discussions have remained private, and I want to honour that. But you've seen us very publicly calling for a climate trigger in our environment laws. You can draw your own conclusions about what that means might have been said other than publicly. But we're going to keep pushing for that because we need it. And I do note that the government has not yet ruled it out publicly either.
Next question is from Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review. One of those other measures that you talked about trying to stop new coal and gas mines was the safeguards mechanism and the debate around that that's going to be coming. How do you sort of what are your thoughts on how you could use the safeguard mechanisms to stop that? I mean, how would it work? Would you have something like maybe if a new mine did open, it would have to fully offset its emissions, not just that generated at the time, but also from burning coal in the customer's country in China and Japan or wherever it ends up? I mean, I'm just keen to see what your thoughts are and where you go with that.
Yes, I mean, and these are the questions and that have to be looked at, during the course of the design of the safeguard mechanism. The Minister has said publicly that new projects will be caught by the safeguard mechanism. He said that publicly. So the question is, what are the obligations that are imposed on those new projects? That's something that over the next few months obviously has to be worked through. That is, as I said during my speech, one of the areas that we're going to push to say the safeguard mechanism needs to reflect climate reality, But as I say, there's also the climate trigger. There's withdrawal of fossil fuel subsidies. There's a number of ways that this problem can be tackled. We need to get the government to acknowledge that opening more coal and gas mines is a problem. Through the amendments that we've secured to this bill, we're a smaller step closer towards stopping coal and gas projects, because now it'll be harder for government to fund coal and gas projects as a result of some of those amendments, but we do still have further to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up on that before we go to the next question. If the safeguard mechanism is really robust and puts an obligation on all new projects to basically reduce emissions or offset emissions, if it was robust enough, would that mean you may not need the climate trigger in the EPBC Act?
Look, I think we need a climate trigger in the EPBC Act. That's the State of the Environment report gives the government all the evidence and justification it needs to understand that big parts of Australia's environment are collapsing, and the single biggest driver is the climate crisis, which is fuelled by coal and gas. So an environment law that allows projects to go ahead even if it makes climate change worse and destroys the environment is an environment law with a massive hole in the middle of it. So you need a climate trigger in the Act. But you're right, there are other ways that this could be dealt with, including with the safeguard mechanism. And that over the next few months, we will have more to say about that, because as you say, it depends what obligation the safeguard mechanism puts on these projects. If the safeguard mechanism allows big polluting coal and gas projects to go ahead, we would blow even the weak 43% target. Like, it'll blow even Labor's weak target, let alone the contribution that it's going to make to the climate crisis.
Next question from Anna Henderson.
Thank you. Anna Henderson, SBS World News and NITV. Firstly, was your party room unanimous in the decision?
It was a consensus decision, yes.
Was anybody clearly against it?
Well, we've made it very clear we've got a consensus decision. Consensus is consensus, and we're all going to vote for it. And you'd expect during the course of any discussion people are going to be putting different views. But we have come to a consensus decision, right, which we will all unanimously vote for.
Thank you. And if I may very briefly, voice to Parliament. This morning the Prime Minister said he's very focused on the referendum. He thinks anyone who thinks a treaty could be progressed in this term of Parliament would be very ambitious. Do you agree?
Well, there's a lot of straw arguments going on about this and about our position on things, and I want to be absolutely clear. There is absolutely no reason that we can't commence process towards truth-telling and treaty now. We could start it right now. Victorian government has started it, right? The Victorian government has started it. We can begin it right now. Now, we, as Senator Lydia Thorpe announced over the weekend, are looking forward to having discussions and negotiations with the government about their proposal for voice.
I don't want to verbal the Prime Minister. He said to achieve it, to be very specific, in this term of Parliament. Do you still think that is something that could be achieved?
Well, again, I want to be crystal clear. When we go into those discussions with the government about proposal for voice, we want to see a number of things. We want to see progress towards truth-telling and treaty start in this parliament. Right? We want to see a start down the road of truth-telling and treaty. We want to see the recommendations from the previous Royal Commission reports into black deaths in custody and also the bringing them home reports into the stolen generation implemented. It is time to do that, to take action on that. And that is something that can start now. And the government, we also want to see the government support for our push that Senator Lydia Thorpe is introducing into the Parliament to have the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the enshrined right to self-determination recognised here in Australia. Those are all things that are eminently achievable, could start now, could perhaps even finish before a referendum when it comes to implementing some of those recommendations from the Royal Commission reports. I mean, they've sat on shelves for too long and it's time to implement them. So those are things that we will put. And it's not accurate to say that anything other than what I've just said, that we are saying it is time to start the progress towards truth-telling and treaty.
Thanks. The next question is from Chantal Al-Khoury.
The former Chief of Defence Force, Angus Houston, says the security situation is the worst he's seen in his lifetime. Do you share his concern, and what would the Greens propose Australia do to keep the nation safe in an era of increasing Chinese regional assertiveness?
Yeah, well, I take a lot of strength and agree very strongly with the words of former Defence Chief Chris Barry, who said very, very clearly that the greatest security threat to us in our region is climate change. He was crystal clear about that. This is someone who's been in the most senior positions in the Australian Defence Force. They know, when you look at it with a clear-eyed lens, that the risk of escalation of conflict and intensified conflict that is going to come from scarcity of resources in our region is enormous. The people movement that is going to happen as whole countries and areas of countries start to face challenges. Feeding themselves or having enough water to drink is going to be immense. And some places, like our Pacific Island neighbours, may become uninhabitable for the people who live there. It's an existential threat. So I do listen to former Defence Force chiefs, and in particular Chris Barry, because it is the critical threat. And I understand that the government is now, just today, announcing that it is going through a review, including of Australia's defence policy. I hope it takes into account the climate crisis, which is the biggest security threat to us in our region.
In saying that, where do the Greens stand on, increasing defence spending? In the past, they've said they would, cancel defence contracts and cut that spending. Look, I've made it clear in my previous answer that we need a plan for de-escalation of conflict, and we need a truly independent Australian foreign policy. And what we have seen over recent years is, from recent governments, is Australia contract out its foreign policy and also its defence policy to other countries, including the United States. And the purchase of submarines designed to be able to travel at much longer range is, even on their own admission, part of just adding to the US Navy's offensive capabilities, rather than it having gone through an independent assessment that it's actually in Australia's best interests, right? We need a defence force in this country that is fit for purpose and fit for defending this country, and a foreign policy that is based on putting our interests first. We need to be more self-reliant. And the longer that we contract out our defence and foreign policies to other countries, the less safe our country becomes.
Thank you. And since we've moved on to national security for a minute, are you comfortable with Australia supplying arms to Ukraine at the moment? The commitment has now reached 388 million howitzers, armoured personnel carriers and so forth. Are the Greens comfortable with that? Do the Greens support that support for Ukraine?
Look, that's a decision the government's made, and I presume that they're going to continue to make it one of the what we're pushing for with respect to Ukraine in particular, and we've condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms. Vladimir Putin derives 40% of his government's revenue from the sale of fossil fuels. And if ever there was a case to get off gas, it's now, and it's to stop buying it off dictators. And this is potentially an opportunity if Australia works with the rest of the world on a policy that involves getting off gas. It's an opportunity not only to cut pollution, but also to cut the power of dictators and autocrats in petrostates.
Next question from Tess Economou.
Thank you very much for your speech. Mr. Bandt, do you believe there are any inconsistencies with Labor's support for nuclear power for a submarine, but not nuclear power for our cities?
Look, we support nuclear non-proliferation, right? The world has come to the brink of catastrophe before, and it's been the work of a lot of people to pull it back, and we've got to make sure we don't go there again. And we do not support Australia having a fleet of floating Chernobyls in the form of these submarines to be bought, and it is inconsistent to start increasing the nuclear capability here in Australia at the same time as saying the rest of the world needs to get out of nukes. We support getting out of nukes.
Next question is from Nick Stewart.
In your speech, you said for the first time, I suspect since 1975, that the government shouldn't expect just to get its budgets rolled through the Senate, even though they come to you in one particular bill, so you can't pick and choose. What would you do to actually implement your policies into the budget? If, for example, the government said, as it currently is, that it's going to proceed with the tax cuts for billionaires, how would you indicate that you want those stopped so that you can then pass the budget? Would you just stop the whole thing, or is there some means by which you'd be trying to move it on?
Well, the latter, but let me say this. Budget and budget measures usually require a number of bills, and there might be one bill that contains spending on a number of measures, but there's usually a number of other bills that implement the various programs that are part of that budget. Those bills have got to get through the Senate, right? Secondly, bills can be amended. Right? Bills can be amended, and that has historically happened in this parliament, including budget bills, to say you can't spend money on this. On this particular thing, or you have to spend less. So we're not talking about what you're talking about, what you're alluding to, but I think it's increasingly dawning on this government that, despite what they said prior to the election, actually to get things through Parliament, you've got to work with others, right? And others will have a say, including on a number of measures that are associated with the budget.
So the government needs to negotiate?
Yes.
Yep.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? So you're not talking about blocking a supply bill?
That's right.
But are we looking at a scenario like 2014? I think that's the last time where we saw a new government come in and then find incredible difficulty in getting its budget through because there was resistance in the parliament, in that case from Labor and the Greens. Are we looking at that kind of scenario if Labor doesn't get this budget right?
Well, budget's got a number of measures, and when governments put forward unpopular budgets, they can expect them to be modified in the Senate and sent back to the government for reconsideration. And that has happened in the past, and we're putting the government clearly on notice that the stage 3 tax cuts will worsen inequality. Secondly, enough with the austerity rhetoric and saying that people are going to have to put up with cuts at a time when people are living in poverty and can't afford to make ends meet, when we know that big gas corporations aren't even paying any tax, and we're spending over $10 billion a year on handouts to big corporations that are wrecking our planet. So there's plenty of ways to ensure that the money is there to fund services. But if the government starts going down a liberal light austerity road, don't come to the Senate and expect us to rubber stamp it through.
Next question is from David Denham.
David Denham from Preview magazine. That was a very rousing speech. Congratulations on that. That was good. I want to change tack a little bit. and talk about sustainability, because I had one of the major factors in Australian sustainability and global is the number of people we've got on the planet. And when I look at the Greens policy, it's rather vague on that. It just says, oh, you've got to consider these factors and those factors and all the rest of it. But can you provide a more concrete and viable and understandable policy? Say, given we have the same usage of resources as we have now, you should be able to calculate that. So can you be more precise in what your policy is on that?
Well, I guess, and it's that last sentence of yours, which I guess marks out our position, which is it's the usage of resources, right? That is fundamentally the issue. Like it is often the case that some of the more populous countries are some of the least polluting countries, certainly per capita, often in overall terms as well. It's not population that is driving pollution, it is coal and gas that are driving pollution. And we've got a huge, huge obligation to get out of coal and gas. That is the cause of pollution. Getting out of it and then assisting other countries to make the transition as well, especially if those countries aren't as rich and wealthy as Australia, is also part of our obligation. So for us, we put that first. Secondly, for those who are concerned about that issue, education of women. Educate women. That is one of the most important and best thing we can do, is educate and support women.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Anna Henderson.
Thank you. Anna Henderson, SBS and NITV. Adam Bandt, in terms of your message to those who voted Green at the election and may be disappointed by your decision today, what do you say to them? And what is the first project that the Greens will now target in the coal and gas sector to try and prevent it going ahead?
Look, we were upfront with people during the election that we would push the government to go further and faster, and that when it came to this bill, our preference was to improve and pass it, and that's what we've done. And did we get everything we wanted? No. Are we a step closer to stopping new coal and gas projects from opening? Yes. Have we made a weak bill better? Yes.
Can you explain how you're a step closer to stopping them? Apart from the rhetoric, what changes now that helps you proceed?
It's now going to be more difficult for governments to fund new coal and gas projects. We believe it's going to be demonstrated that it will be impossible for the government to meet even this weak target if it goes ahead with opening new coal and gas projects. We are a step closer to having a real support package for workers and communities who are transitioning out of coal and gas. And we are now put squarely on notice that when the safeguard mechanism is developed, that it's got to deal with the question of new coal and gas projects. And we will be putting forward our view very strongly to the government about that, remembering, of course, that that is a disallowable instrument.
And the first project?
There's a number already underway. The Scarborough projects off the coast of Western Australia. We are going to continue to stand side by side with traditional owners in that Scarborough project to stop that proceeding. The Beetaloo project in the Northern Territory as well is huge. People have heard about Adani. Beetaloo is worse. There's in those Northern Territory gas basins, there's the equivalent of about 70 years worth of Australia's emissions locked up there. It has to stay in the ground. We will be joining the campaign strongly, both in Scarborough and Beetaloo and Narrabri in New South Wales, to say these new gas projects cannot go ahead.
And the last question is from Astrid Watts.
Hi Adam, nice to see you again. My question, this morning a landmark bill passed the House of Representatives to allow the ACT and Northern Territory to regain territory rights. My question is, will the Greens be supporting this in the Senate, and how do you think it's going to change Australian politics?
Yes, this is a very good day to see progress on this. We would have liked it to have come earlier when we introduced our bill to do exactly the same thing. Look, if it takes a government backbencher moving exactly the same bill to come and do it, then okay. But what matters is that now people who live in the territories are a step closer to having the same rights as everyone else. And it is something that we supported, and we're going to support in the Senate as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your time today, Adam. We appreciate it. We know how busy it is up on the in Parliament House, so we've covered a lot of ground. We have a gift for you, which is lifetime membership of the National Press Club. We hope that we see you back here regularly, so we appreciate your time. Everyone, please welcome Adam Bandt. Oh, please thank Adam Bandt.
Thank you.